In the US, besides Meta, we have been putting I would say if not all of our eggs, perhaps the vast majority of our eggs in the closed source AI basket, whereas China has been doing a lot more for open source compared to their closed source investment. I think it's becoming increasingly clear to people that open source may be a better strategy, because even if you have a small quality gap, people will prefer the open source models. All enterprise I talk to, researchers, they now use the Qwens, the Deepseeks, or the Llamas. They don't want to use the closed source, because okay, these models are competitive. Even enterprises, because they know they can use these open models, customize them to their data, and they get a solution that is way better than the black box it comes out of OpenAI, Anthropic, or Gemini. I think it's going to become clearer and clearer to more people that the open source is the winning strategy. And I think hopefully Deepseek gave a good wake-up call that we need to be doing more of that also in the US, because otherwise we're going to be watching China or somebody else from the sidelines.
All right. So, hello and welcome everyone to whoever is tuning into this particular podcast. Today, I have with me Manos Koukoumidis. Manos is the CEO of Oumi, a platform focused on open sourcing the entire life cycle of foundation and large models. Prior to that, he was at Google leading efforts on developing large language models within the cloud services department. And he also has experience working at Facebook on AR/VR projects and also at Microsoft's cloud division, developing machine learning based services. Manos received his PhD in computer engineering from Princeton University and has an extensive hands-on experience background building and deploying models at large scale. So Manos, welcome to the podcast and thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having me, Jay. It's a pleasure.
So to get started with the introduction and letting the audience learn more about you, can you share a little bit about your journey from leading generative AI and large language models at Google and then co-founding Oumi? Like, what motivated this transition and what were the specific problems or challenges that you noticed while you were working there that led to this venture?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I'll go a little bit even more back in history. I started with Gen AI, even though we didn't call it like that, back in 2016 when I was at Microsoft. We started building something like multimodal ChatGPT back then. It was an open-ended chatbot, respond to any questions, including images, even things now that we call embedding-based retrieval and RAG. Actually, I built that RAG system myself back then. But there were no transformers. We're using LSTMs for generation. And even back then when we built it, we said with senior leadership that would be an experiment. That's how we called it all the time, because we're not sure how people would react. And people were very impressed, but the quality was not there yet. That's why after 2 years, as an effort, it was shut down. And by the time actually I had left and moved to Meta. And then I worked with conversational AI also on Meta, but I'll skip forward. And then when I was at Google, as you mentioned, I was leading all the natural language AI services, the science and engineering teams, some multimodal and document processing. And about a couple months before the GPT came out, I was starting the efforts to productionize Palm. That was, again, before the GPT launched, so people were not paying as much attention. But actually, I was making the case for almost a year before the GPT launched that, hey, we should try this again, because, for example, summarization. Humans prefer now machine-generated summaries compared to human-created summaries. And text-to-text models are very universal. People and customers may use them for many scenarios beyond what we can anticipate. So we should put it out there, make it safe, because it won't be easy. I already had a lot of scars from building that system back in 2016 and spending a lot of effort on making it safe, so it doesn't say objectionable stuff. So that, again, we put it out there, we see how customers use it, make it safe. So when we see where the opportunities are, we're ready to take them. Again, that was almost a year before ChatGPT came out. I only got the green light and started building this only a couple months before ChatGPT, but then ChatGPT comes out, of course, huge excitement in the field, makes my job even easier, quickly recruit many people across Google to help. It was, over 30 teams, over 300 people that I counted at some point that were contributing to iterate on the pre-training, post-training, the privacy and safety inside Palm or extra systems we build around it, building the inference and training APIs, discussions to building a business planning teams for the pricing, plus anything it took to make into a product, until we launched it in general availability in May of 23. And then it was decided that, this effort is going to move to DeepMind. It's going to also be rebranded as Gemini and so on, where I continue to be very involved in many of the efforts, especially on alignment and safety. But by that time, I was already starting to, not to connect it also with Oumi, I was starting to get, for one, concern that, I wasn't sure if that's the future I wanted to be building. Because these foundational models, and that's why we call them foundation models, they're being used not just for the tech industry, but I was hearing more and more how people use them for material science and climate science and healthcare, for so many scenarios. And I was thinking that, it's going to be very problematic for both sciences and the industry if those foundation models remain closed, because that doesn't help the sciences and everybody else to progress. And I was like, okay, philosophically, it's a very bad outcome for sciences, industry, humanity overall if that fundamental technology remains closed. But I was like, okay, it's bad for philosophically, but can something be done about it? And then increasingly, I started realizing that, actually, something can definitely be done about it, because the most likely outcome, if anything, is that in the future, the open source version of these technologies, both as models and overall ecosystem around those models as platforms, will actually be better than for closed models. And there's a lot of lessons in history, about why that was the case for some of the most complex systems that we built before. Like, for example, databases where PostgreSQL got more market share than Oracle, or Linux by far dominating over closed source Unix. And, it was not just to say, okay, it happened for other open source technologies, can happen for AI. Specifically for AI, one thing that was clear to me is that there's not enough people inside OpenAI or Google or any of these labs that operate in a silo to advance these technologies sufficiently, because it's very complex technologies across many modalities, many use cases, and an open community could do this better. Yeah, they may not have huge cluster, but they actually can do it better and build both better models and better ecosystems around them. And then on the same time, I started realizing that, these closed source models or closed source AI, as I like to say, unless you are one of the few aspiring AI oligarchs, these few companies who people know who they are, nobody else wants closed source, because they can optimize their systems for them. For example, if let's say OpenAI dominates, everybody's going to go use OpenAI on Azure, perhaps on the specific accelerators that Microsoft or Sam Altman wants to build. NVIDIA knows this, AMD knows this, all the other cloud providers know this. So that's why they all want open source succeed. At the same time, consumer companies like Mark Zuckerberg has said publicly, I really want open source succeed because I can't be at the mercy of any other company to get access to AI that I need for my own consumer products. So then I started realizing that, also there's huge interests, huge players in the ecosystem that really want open source succeed. So one, philosophically, closed source is bad for humanity, greatly misaligned interests with huge players in the ecosystem. And three, actually open source as a development approach can lead to better, safer models and ecosystem. I was like, okay, actually, that's going to be the most plausible outcome in the future. So it only makes sense to help build this, because the community and even both academic community and enterprise were missing a platform that makes it easy for them to do this research and development of foundation models. And that's what led to me. It was not one event. It was like this three things that made me realize, it's the right thing to do. And it's also the most plausible future outcome, because it's the best for enterprise, the best for everybody, the most efficient way to develop foundation models. So we should go build that.
Yeah, this is very fascinating. And before we even jump to like comparing open source versus closed source, something you said very interesting, and I always wanted to ask someone, since you have been working in this field for a long time, and you mentioned you were working on RAG or similar kind of techniques even at Microsoft. This is like far before even like the whole large language model era came in. So I'm very curious, and maybe you can help me paint a picture. Is like why like if you're working on RAG, that means there were like systems in place or models in place that were able to generate language data in some sufficient capacity. So what really happened in I think 2022, right? Like when ChatGPT came out, like why was it that Microsoft or Google, like they had the architecture backbone, they had the data? Why was it that ChatGPT made the biggest appearance in terms of getting to users, but not big tech companies?
Yeah, I think I mean, arguably, as I can say, even while I was putting forward the case, I had put in my strategy doc how we need to build these text-to-text models, give them to customers, and have them test them. I was not expecting that it would be as big. I could see there was a good opportunity, but not as big. As OpenAI admitted, they also would not expect it would be as big. So it kind of surprised almost everyone. But I can say, I was seeing glimpses of this back in 2016. Because when people would see that, there's this chatbot that even across both text and images, even back then, you would send an image of let's say, a foot that has a wound, and it would ask you, oh, what happened is that your foot? What happened? You would say, oh, yeah, I injured my foot. It's like, oh, I'm so sorry for you. You would have pretty good conversation in text and with images back then. But let's say 1 out of 10 cases, it would say something almost random, and people are like, okay, this thing is not so smart after all, because it's like 1 out of 10. But now if you look at ChatGPT or when it was launched, I don't know, maybe it's only 1 out of 100, if ever, that. Okay, if you're not counting how many R's are in strawberry, right? Perhaps most of the cases, maybe 1 of the 100, it would say something completely nonsensical. So it was so much more accurate, and also the overall quality was substantial, difference higher, that it was good enough to capture the imagination of people. Because again, I could see glimpses of that back then. There's people who were very impressed, but it was just not good enough. So that's why I think it was a good step function increase in terms of quality that happened across the years, probably from 2016 to 2022. And the fact that OpenAI did very well, which is they made it easily accessible, putting in the hands of people. And then that almost made them go viral because everybody was discussing about how amazing it was.
Right.
Yeah, again, even though I could see glimpses of that even back in 2016 with a much more primitive solution. I mean, similar
Yeah.
architecture, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, yeah, it's very fascinating because like how the scaling laws really look in reality, that is very fascinating to always see that once you train it with a very clean data set with a lot of instructions and a lot of quality, I think how these architectures and performances can scale is really fascinating. But one thing you did mention is like you compared open sourcing the AI and the whole pipeline to compare it to something like Linux versus closed source Unix. So I wanted to dig a little bit deeper on that and like understand what your vision, like how do you envision open sourcing AI? Like now we know what Linux looks like. It's like present in I think more than, I don't know, 95% of devices that is running any OS basically. So maybe like, can you paint us a picture for like maybe how the next 5 to 10 years or maybe how 10 to 15 years look like for you on open source? And secondly, a follow up on that question, maybe you can continue on that is like, and I'm sure a lot of people would have asked the same question, is the risk profiles of these two different elements are different, right? Like open source in Linux, which is like a fairly OS, it doesn't interact with the humans, but versus something like ChatGPT or some kind of AI model that is interacting with me, changing my opinions. How do you compare these two risk profiles? As in, like open source is Linux, is it the same as open sourcing AI models that has impact as a layman in the worlds?
Yeah, very good. If I forget to answer the second part of the question, please remind me. But starting
Yeah,
from the first one, how I see the future evolving. As opposed to just making a prediction and say, okay, that's a prediction, but why are you saying this? I would maybe start from this and say, what's happening right now? I can already see a big trend of, first of all, it's already clear to many people that the gap between open models and closed models is closing. If you look how fast, for example, Deepseek, the same for almost for Llama and Quen, have been closing the gap with closed models, has been very, very fast the last couple of months. So that's one that already people realize. The one that also many people may not realize is that as a result of this gap closing, but also many enterprises maturing in their understanding of Gen AI, say, you know what, I played with this black box that was, that was like OpenAI or Gemini or Anthropic, but now I want to get more flexibility, more control, as opposed to using a black box. Or maybe because of privacy, because I'm a regulated industry, I can't send my data to OpenAI. It needs to run on my own VPC or on-prem. They say, you know what, I need to move to more, for any of these reasons, I need to move to more open technologies. So I see an increasing trend of such companies that want to move to open technologies. And I think that trend is only going to be increasing. I think we're seeing I think it's like the increase even is happening at an increasing pace. The second derivative, it's actually increasing.
accelerating.
And exactly, it's accelerating. And I think it's going to be almost the same again, as you mentioned, with Linux and Unix, where I think the majority of use cases in enterprises or consumer scenarios are going to be driven by open source AI and not the black box. One way, again, to justify this, besides looking at the trends, is to, just again, painting the analogy with Linux. When Unix came out, I think it was by Bell Labs, people said, you know what, this is the best operating system created by the best engineers at Bell Labs. Nobody else has the know-how or the engineering capacity, to build something competitive. Until Linux came out, and it was not as good. And you could say the same thing perhaps now with open models. They're not as good perhaps as the closed ones, even though actually they're very, very close. And once you customize them, actually they become better. But actually, that's what people said with Linux back then. It's not as good, but because it's open source, I can customize it to my needs. Because it's open box, I can. And then it will become at least as good as Unix, if not better. And then I have the privacy, the security, I can deploy to my own infrastructure and at lower cost. So that's why people use Linux, even though it was not as good out of the box compared to Unix. And more and more people started using it to the point that the community became better. And then the whole ecosystem, and they made both Linux better and the whole ecosystem around it. And again, I would say the same thing is happening for whoever is paying attention. The same thing is happening at an accelerating pace with AI as well. So that's why it's very clear. I mean, the trends are very clear. That's been what has happened in the past with many other such similar technologies. And what I tell people is that for AI, it's going to be happening in an even more profound way. Because the more complex such a technology is, the more amenable is in many ways to be advanced by an open community that is not just 2,000-3,000 people, but it's orders of magnitude larger than the engineers within a silo, like let's say within OpenAI or within DeepMind or within Anthropic. And this is also good news for all of us because it's much better to build this technology in the open as opposed to in a closed way, for all the, many, many benefits for humanity, enterprise sciences. Now you mentioned about the risk profile. Yeah, definitely the risk profile for these technologies is arguably even higher than for operating systems. They're much more complex. You could argue much more powerful. And exactly for this reason, this is why these technologies makes even more sense to keep them open. Unfortunately, what's happening right now is because the existing, aspiring AI oligarchs, because they see a huge monetary reward, if they win this in the end, they're all racing to one-up each other in the leaderboards and suggest how they're better than each other. And they're taking shortcuts. Arguably, the investment in some areas like safety may not be, actually, I would argue it's not what it should be. And that's also, and these are very hard problems. Right? It's not trivial problems that they're just not investing at all. It's just, they're hard problems. And that's why these technologies can be developed better in the open. Because then, as Linus Torvalds had said that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And I like to rephrase and say, given enough eyeballs, all AI issues are shallow. So you can develop better and safer AI when you have a whole community looking at this more transparently, as opposed to trapping in a black box and forcing people to use it behind an API.
Yeah. And I wonder what you think, because initially you did mention that open source models are catching up with the closed source models, right? So in terms of your intuition, like I know you might not have the right answer for this because it itself is closed source AI. But in terms of your intuition, like what do you think these closed source models are doing that gives them an edge over to open source models? Is it purely because of the proprietary data that they are using and maybe we don't have access to, like how they are training those labels? Or is it because like I primarily work in computer vision, so like I have much lesser background to understanding these benchmarks and these models. But like there are so many different benchmarks. I think some of the data sets and benchmarks are getting obsolete, right? Like people are coming up with new evaluations, and these models will try to overfit and even beat these benchmarks. So like, can you talk us like what is the gap? Like what is your intuition why this gap is still existing between open source, which certainly is smaller than before, but what is the current state of art for that?
Yeah, I think in many ways it's a head start problem. That OpenAI, for example, was investing enough. Yeah, I mean, there were efforts at Google, but they were not so carefully steered towards this specific outcome, a model like ChatGPT. And OpenAI had the head start, and when, even we were trying to catch up with Palm and then with Gemini, we're, you could say two waves behind, then a 1 wave behind, then maybe now half a wave behind. But even within the different labs, the gaps are closing. I remember even the first few months of Palm, I was working with the very first customers, very big reputable companies that I'm sure you recognize, that they'll say, okay, your quality is lower than OpenAI's, but I've been amazed how fast you're closing the quality gap with them. So that's why the quality gap the first few months was extremely high, but it closed very fast, and it's getting narrower and narrower and narrower. Of course, closing the very last gap becomes harder, harder, harder at the end. But I think that quality benefits that OpenAI may have compared to Anthropic, even though Anthropic is already better, for example, in coding, they're not going to be sustained. In the same way, they also won't be sustained against the open community. That being said, for open source to succeed, there were still some things that could be done better to help open source AI to succeed, which also the things that we were aiming to solve with Oumi, which was we were talking with many academics, and they were saying that even for our students to now to do this type of research is way harder compared to what it was a couple years ago. There's a lot of infrastructure they need to put together. If you want to test a model as a general instruct model, there's so many different benchmarks, and actually there's across many different repositories you need to integrate and clone or to be able to test these things holistically. And many of them, I would say 9 out of 10 that we haven't done distributed training, because for us to put together all this infrastructure to train, evaluate the models, it took us so much effort. And then maybe we tried distributed multi-node training, but actually it was too hard. We never managed to do it, or maybe we were already defeated by that time that we didn't try distributed training. And only again, 1 out of 10 students I would talk to, they tried doing it. And sometimes they were affiliated with Meta or some other institution to publish their paper. That's why we said, this shouldn't be hard. All these different universities, we wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel, reinvent how they can put together this infrastructure that they need to do these different steps. And that was, again, a discussion we had with Ruslan Salagodino from CMU, even before Oumi exists as a company. And he said, you know what, it would really help if such a platform existed, but it's too hard for any of my students to go do this. If you do it,
Right.
it will be greatly helpful for us and we'll support you. But yeah, somebody like you should go build this, within the context of a company. And that's why we set out to build Oumi. Was like an end-to-end platform, helps you do research and development across all the different stages, from pre-training, post-training, evaluation. Again, that was a key gap that we saw that was missing, because if it's easy for people to do this research, also in a platform that captures everything end-to-end, and that's very important so that you can record the full recipe for how you improve something end-to-end. Because before, if people have to use something for training, something else to do some inference, or for that evaluation versus that evaluation, then it's too hard for somebody else to reproduce. People say there is dark knowledge. There's things that they still block them from reproducing each other's work. And it's just slowing down the community from building out of each other and improving each other's work. And so it's like all this unnecessary friction that we say, we should remove. We build something that just works, help people do their experiments. They don't have to reinvent and resolve the same problems that they don't want to solve, because they want to do the research, not the plumbing. And also in a way that makes it easy for them to record the full recipes and helps the next person build upon them, cite their paper, reproduce it, and help make it better. So anyway, that's one thing that was missing. The other ones you mentioned, it's also benchmarks. You could imagine that, and I would bet that OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, they all have their own benchmarks. So better benchmarks for the community is something that would help as well to stay the effort. So yeah, better platform, better benchmarks. Of course, the more GPUs they can get their hands on also would be great. But I think I'm hearing more and more, which is encouraging, how universities are getting at least a couple dozen GPUs per lab. And even those could be enough to do experiments at small scale. And then somebody like us or a partner can take to blow them up and train a bigger model and then send results back to the community. But anyway, yeah, we're hoping to solve the platform problem. We're going to do more work on helping on the benchmarks, at least wherever we can. And on the GPUs, I think things are getting better. At least we're also trying to help our collaborators. But yeah, I'm very optimistic about the future of open source frontier AI.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. I think the whole stack that you said is really important for people to understand. And I wonder, in your experience of considering open sourcing the whole stack, like which components do you think you want to ensure as a person who is like advocating open source AI, like you think is the most important in terms of driving innovation? Because in terms of like as a researcher, like we want to be a person who drives innovation, right? Like we publish and we constantly push the boundaries of science. Which part of this whole stack do you think is the most important thing in your understanding that needs to remain open source in order to help new students, like maybe someone like me who can understand things from very fundamentals and then drive innovation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Perhaps the best way I see it, I mean, there's research problems across the stack, from pre-training to how do you do better post-training. Even evaluation itself, it's a research problem because it's very hard to robustly evaluate those models, especially models that are generative. They're not discriminative, right? They generate any open open-ended output. There's research on making training more efficient, making inference more efficient, like research all across the different stages. Then research for specific capabilities. Now, pre-training is the area where it's harder for the community to make progress. Yeah, they could pre-train smaller models, and hopefully if they prove a recipe, somebody could take it and blow it up and pre-train a better model for them. But at least the good news is that with contributions like the ones with Meta, the Llama models, or other Chinese companies, Alibaba, Deepseek, these are already great tools that then the community can use to iterate and do research on post-training approaches. How can I DPO, GRPO from Deepseek, or other different approaches where they can improve existing models on many of the different use cases that exist, or evaluation, as I mentioned before, safety, all these different use cases. And the good news, at least for this type of research, is that you don't need that many GPUs to take and post-train, especially an 8 billion Llama. And it's very approachable research for many students. But even for that, it's if somebody has to invent, okay, what do I need to use for training? And then if I want to curate my own data, let's say I want to use, maybe I train I just train an 8B Llama. But for me, I want to synthesize data using a 4 or 5B Llama, because the bigger the model, the better quality I can get, or maybe using some closed model like Claude or OpenAI. And then you have to figure out how do you integrate with all these things, how you do this batch processing, batch inference, or writing your own LLM judges to curate your data and clean it up before you use it to train and improve the model some capability. I mean, all these things take a lot of friction, especially the bigger models you want to use, at least, let's say for data synthesis, the more friction for people to figure out how they can do that. So anyway, yeah, that's why, again, we're trying to solve all these steps, because especially for post-training and evaluation and all these steps, I think this is very approachable research for the academia and the community. You don't need to break the bank in terms of GPU usage. And the good news is also it's where I think it's a huge opportunity for innovation. In some ways, perhaps a lot of the innovation has happened lately has been with techniques that happened after the model was pre-trained, as opposed to changing the next token prediction pre-training algorithm. So
Yeah. And yeah, that's a fantastic point. And one thing, like just to close back the loop on comparing closed source versus open source, I wonder what you think about. I think that this was like a year back when Ilya gave an interview where he said, like, once you have models with very similar, like very small capacities, it's fine enough to think about open sourcing AI. But once you have models that have like vast capacity of like doing bigger, like basically vast capabilities to do things, it will be very irresponsible for a company to open source AI. Like, I wonder what you think about that, because it's always the debate of understanding the liabilities of open source is something that can fall into bad hands, versus yes, there is a good intention of open sourcing AI, but we don't expect that there are no bad actors misusing these technologies. So like, I wonder what you have to add on to that.
yeah, I don't think we should take all knives and make them more blunt just so that somebody doesn't use them in any bad way. Because, and especially, for something like AI that is such a great tool that would be such great usage. And I tell people, it's almost like a matter of life and death, even with AI. And perhaps to take a small detour here, if you allow me, Jay. There was the Human Genome Project, quite some time back. And as I tell people, regardless of where you stand with politics and what you think about Bill Clinton, he made that code that resonated with me. When they were like sequencing the Human Genome Project, they said, they could have kept that information secret so that, some industries can monetize freely, or they could open source, they can make it publicly available. And he said that it would be virtually criminal if they were to withhold this information from the public just so that some enterprise can monetize, when releasing it would help people to develop better, medications, better healthcare, better things that for, matters that are life and death. And the same thing, you could make this argument for AI. I was in a summit recently where I won't mention specific names, representatives of some of the biggest healthcare companies that would say, you know what, if you use AI to assist you with different diagnostic procedures, they're not just 10 or 20%, but like 4 times, 5 times better than humans. So it's going to be standard practice soon, the use of AI. and it's going to be malpractice if you don't use AI. And the idea is that, if we help advance all these things, we can save also so many human lives, besides advancing the sciences, improving quality of life, not just healthcare, but, beyond all of these different sciences. But anyway, again, somebody could say, okay, but yes, there's also all this risk of this being abused. I don't think we have reached, I mean, who knows, maybe I may revise my opinion once we reach AGI or the scale of a model that is so powerful that, maybe we need to think about a little bit more about how we expose it, but I think we're still far from that. For the level that we're in now, and I think we're going to be at least for a little bit more time, well, I would rather not hypothesize if and when we're going to reach AGI. That's a whole different topic by itself. But at least we're not there right now. And I think we're doing a disservice to humanity if we're closing the tools that we have right now in the name of doing things that are safer, but perhaps they are to protect the financial interests of specific companies. Because again, if anything, those tools are extremely useful for the sciences. We should make them accessible so that all the sciences and industries can advance. And even, with the tools that we have right now, let's say, as they continue to advance for some foreseeable time, I really agree. Actually, Mark Zuckerberg put it very well in his blog some time back, where he said that, there's many more good actors in the world than bad actors. So if you make those tools open, there's so many more people that can help and work on securing these systems and finding ways you can detect different threats by people who abuse AI, as opposed to keeping a black box and hopefully, hoping that nobody, used it in a bad way. So that's one. And the other one, he said, if you are worried about bad actors, state nations, they could still infiltrate and find ways to extract information from OpenAI or Anthropic and all these companies, right? So one way or another, closed source doesn't really give you much protection against organized and well-funded state nations that could infiltrate all these, even the closed organizations. And then you can have, if you keep it open, more good actors than bad actors that can help develop better technologies. And even in the absence of any bad actors, AI as it stands still has a lot of issues and biases and opportunities for improvement for the benefit of all of us. The best way to do it is if you keep it open, you invite all the community to help make it better. So I think, I'll be honest, when I hear about more people saying, oh, we should keep it closed, I think I still see it more as an argument of them trying to protect their financial interests than anything else, because it just doesn't make sense to keep such a foundation technology closed. There's still many opportunities for many companies to monetize on top of it. But the core foundation, it's just, we call it foundation models. Right? We call it like that. Even I think the name is very telling. That they're so foundational that they should be accessible and open.
Yeah, I agree. I have been in the research field for almost 5 years, and I wonder if we didn't have access to architectures like ResNets, like at least I work in vision, it would have been like a very stale progress in AI. And compared to that, like once things are open source, we have so many different platforms with different optimizations. I think optimization is one of the key things that I think community can really bring in. And secondly is the security awareness, right? Like now, once you open source the models, people can learn more about like how a model can be exploited, like how can adversarial attacks be done, and then how can we make our architectures much more sustained to these things. So I think people, like once you open source, it allows the community to work on different angles, which is practically impossible for a single community of let's say company professionals to work on different angles. Like it's impossible hard to see science from just one angle, rather than it's like a multidimensional thing where you would expect people from different disciplines, different research focus to work on and make something that's holistically much better.
Totally again, to give you just one more example, I was talking with a academic from NYU, and they were telling me that they were working on hallucination detection. And they were doing a presentation at some point, and in their presentation, they were mentioning that if I don't know what data the model was trained on, it's harder for me to know, is it hallucinating, is it not? I mean, you need to have more details to be able to do a lot of this research.
Yeah, I agree. And asking you as a question as a researcher, because it's very fairly common knowledge that yes, the current limitations of large language models are, let's say, compute data. But in like if you were to exclude these two things, because I think these are like not very interesting things in terms of researchers, what do you think are the current challenges of large language models? If I were to just ask you as a person who works on that, not thinking about like it just from a theoretical standpoint, what do you think are the current limitations of the architectures or the training pipeline that are used for large language models?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, but also a little bit hard to answer. I mean, for one, architectures like transformers, they're highly generic and capable. Could there be better architectures? Perhaps, even though transformers have served as well, of course, with different optimizations across attention mechanisms and different ways. I think I'm still interested, even though I haven't seen much lately. Is there better ways to teach those models? Yeah, for example, next token prediction is something that we use very extensively when pre-training those models. But are there better ways, more intuitive ways to teach those models than next token prediction? For example, even for humans, right? I remember when I was learning as a kid, I would pay more attention to specific tokens that I want to memorize than all the
Yeah.
other details that they're not as important. So there's different ways that we may need to conceive. Jan LeCun has also made a lot of arguments about this. There may be different ways in which we may need to represent the data and have the models learn from data so that we can unlock levels of learning that are even closer to human intelligence, where we can better understand concepts, laws of physics. Our few-shot learning is much more efficient than any of the biggest models we have right now. So yeah, I think there's going to be still a lot of innovation that needs to happen. I think we're still just scratching the surface, which, by the way, that's also why I think you need the whole open community and enable all the cumulative intelligence of all the great research around the world, as opposed to just, again, a couple thousand people that are inside a silo. And they're not even sharing the information with the other couple thousand people that are in the other silo.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, yeah. I completely agree, and I'm very interested. I'm very uh I basically second that opinion, because when I started in 2020 my PhD, I was completing my master's, and at that time I was reviewing the field, understanding like what really means when we say as a researcher we need to drive innovation. And this was the time we were seeing papers like zero shot learning, few shot learning, imitation learning, knowledge distillation. So I was very interested, and once you understand the intuition, it really feels aha moment, right? Like that, oh wow, like once you see things. But I think after 2020 or 2021, I constantly just saw progress in one domain. The archive papers are kind of stagnating. I mean, I'm not saying that it's bad research or it's really redundant research, but like you can see the innovation happening in a very small bubble where people are not thinking about efficient architectures. People are not thinking about efficient modules that can surpass information much more efficiently. Like you said, transformer might be a very extensive way of processing information. It's not very computationally efficient. So yeah,
yeah, and
I agree.
it's because also people would see, right? I mean, they would see the scaling curves. They're like, okay, this is very predictable way how we can make this better. People would start getting very excited. Oh, these things are very powerful. I can just curate my own data in a certain way, and then I can unlock this capability for the model. That's why people for
Right.
quite some time were very motivated about I would say, easy gains perhaps you can get, and say, all the data is the most important thing. Just create it in a certain way. You can unlock this capability in the model. But yeah, I agree. We're going to have to go back to, especially now with the kind of walls we're hitting, go back to the drawing board and find more fundamental ways to make these things better. I think it's still work that needs to happen, right? Even at using existing techniques to make those models safer and better. But yeah, we should go back to the drawing board and look at more fundamental ways for those models in terms of architectures, way they should be learning from. Yeah.
Yeah. And just to switch case, I think one of the biggest events in terms of talking about open source versus closed source AI was, I think, few months back, right? Like when DeepSeek got released. And like, help us paint a picture, like why that moment was such a big moment in terms of news and a lot of researchers. It also got attention of a lot of researchers compared to, let's say, we have a lot of other libraries like Llama or thinking machines, and there are a bunch of like small startups or a group of people who have been open sourcing. But why does the release of DeepSeek really gain that much attention? Like, how does it play along the lines of talking about closed source AI versus open source AI? Like, tell us what you think about the whole event and why it is so much important when we talk about closed versus open source.
Yeah. So DeepSeek definitely brought an earthquake in academia, the stock market, and everything. I would argue perhaps bigger than it should have created. But if anything, it gave the wake-up call to many people. So I see it as a very positive event in many ways, especially for people in the US, I would argue. But yeah, I mean, there was part also of the reason why they got so much press is that they said, I think we trained the model using 5.6 million worth of compute. I think that's the number. But they never said that's all the money they spent. I think they said maybe they did 100 more experiments, right? And they spent a lot more, like orders of magnitude more. But just to do perhaps that final training round, it only cost them 5.6 million. But I think many people in the press, they misunderstood. They say, okay, that's all they spent. And like, okay, somebody met almost the quality of OpenAI's best models just by spending 5.6 million. What does that mean? That OpenAI and everybody else is a huge bubble, which I think actually they still are, but perhaps they thought in exaggerated way. So that's perhaps because of that misperception that the reaction was very, very strong. Plus, people that, they felt that, okay, if now it's so easy to train those models, maybe you don't need to spend as much. And stocks like NVIDIA started going down, which I think is completely unreasonable. If anything, it's the Jevons paradox, where the most efficient models become, the more useful they become for the amount of cost, which means you should only drive demand up. But anyway, yeah, but at the same time, it was still impressive that organization, I think I count around 200 people in the Deepseek paper. I don't know how big exactly the organization is, but that's roughly the number I had counted. That, they produced this model. And actually the things they open sourced a couple of weeks back, week after week, there were some very impressive innovations that they did to train such a model. Yeah, they didn't spend just 5.6 million. They spent a lot more. People hypothesized hundreds of millions, perhaps billion plus. But still, they did some very impressive innovations to do this. And while working perhaps with lower-end GPUs, there are concerns that maybe they got access to more performance GPUs. But anyway, yeah, it's a combination of people thought that they spend way too little money, only 5.6 million, training such a performance model with low-end GPUs, which again may or may not be true, that led to this exaggerated reaction. Like, okay, if those people can train such a performance model with so little money on low-end GPUs, then what is our advantage? What's the advantage of OpenAI and Anthropic and everybody else? So again, many of these statements, perhaps they were not, even though the DeepSeek team they represented things accurately, but perhaps it was misrepresented by the press or in an exaggerated way. Or maybe again, because who knows what access to GPUs they had compared to what they claimed. It led to a very strong reaction. But anyway, as I mentioned before, I think it was a good wake-up call because in the US, besides Meta, we have been putting I would say not, if not all of our eggs, perhaps the vast majority of our eggs in the closed source AI basket. Whereas China has been doing a lot more, especially compared to this, investment. They do a lot more for open source compared to their closed source investment. And I think it's becoming increasingly clear to people that open source may be a better strategy because even if you have a small quality gap, people will prefer the open source models. All enterprise I talk to, researchers, they now use the Qwens, the Deepseeks, or the Llamas. They don't want to use the closed source because, like, okay, these models are competitive. Even enterprises, because they know they can use these open models, customize them to their data, and they get a solution that is way better than the black box it comes out of OpenAI, Anthropic, or Gemini. So I think it's going to become clearer and clearer to more people that the open source is the winning strategy. And I think hopefully Deepseek gave a good wake-up call that, we need to be doing more of that also in the US, because otherwise we're going to be watching China or somebody else from the sidelines. By the way, that was
Right.
also our intuition over a year ago, that this is going to be the trend. History will follow, as it has taught us also in the past. So that's why, again, we built Oumi to help make sure that we help promote open source in the US as well. But I would argue not just in the US. We want to be a collaborative effort, across the world.
Right. And when we talk about leadership of any nation leading, like let's say if China did this, it will help their, like in terms of like how do you assign benefits to leadership because of open sourcing AI? Like is it because it will help build an ecosystem of startups or products that can benefit from that, or like is there anything more to that? Like how do you say if US were to open source, it will maintain its leadership in AI? Like how exactly would that translate
Yeah.
into being leaders in AI?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's based on the, I would say conviction, based on the confidence by just looking at the recent trends. It was a conviction over a year ago. Now I would say it's confidence because the trends are clear and the evidence is there that increasingly open source is becoming the better solution for most enterprises and for researchers in academia. So if you want to have the market share, the mind share, you should be doing more in open source and less in closed source. And given that, this is clearly the winning strategy, and you could argue the genie is already out of the bottle, it's happening. It's a matter of, do you choose to lead in this space? Do you choose to invest in this winning strategy? Or do you want to, again, let somebody else like China do this? And then we are just watching here from the sidelines. And I think it's very important that, that we do more, because it's going to be not just for the benefit of humanity and investment that goes more in open source AI, way more than spending hundreds of billions in closed source. I would say it's a pity, if anything. And yeah, it also helps secure our leadership so that we can make sure we have both the mindset and the know-how here in the US with all the universities and everything, and how we can build all these platforms and these technologies.
Right.
And then also
And
work
would
with
you
the enterprise, enable our enterprise and startups. Yeah.
Right, right. And would you flag any concerns related to national security? Because I have read a bunch of articles. Let's say if there's a model that we are open sourcing without any guardrails, like would you say there should be any security concerns that any organization or someone like Umi, like they need to be concerned about when we are open sourcing and letting other countries like with different political agendas be able to use those models? Like should that be a part of the policy that goes on in open sourcing?
Uh, I would argue that this needs definitely more thinking and see, again, how with policies we should make sure we are doing the right thing. And arguably, it shouldn't be just a single organization like Umi taking, unilaterally the decisions. That's absolutely the right way to do things. That being said, um, at the same time, if you look at the alternatives, they're even scarier. Because what if people end up using a model like DeepSeek, R1 or V3 or whatever, and then when they ask for questions about different historical events like Tiananmen Square, they get uh, the Chinese Communist Party's line of answers. Is that the answers we want to be getting? So that's why, as I mentioned before, it's we need more policy to think what is the best way to expose these technologies. I'll be very, interested in participating in such discussions to see how we should best define those policies. But as I mentioned before, the genie is already out of the bottle, and it would be good if we are the ones that were defining the future as opposed to just following somebody else's uh, innovation and decisions for how this
Yeah.
technology would respond in all these different questions.
Makes sense. And since we have been talking about Umi so far, like can you give us a brief introduction? Because I have seen like most of the audience for these podcasts are young researchers or even like early career researchers who are like fairly new to AI. So if you were to paint a picture, like how if the world without Umi was like if I were to work with a large language model, let's say OpenAI's version or any other models, how does the scenario look like before Umi, after Umi? Like how like paint us as a picture like what Umi does and how does it empower people to work with AI models and deploy AI models?
Yeah, yeah. So let's say, for example, you're a new enterprise and you want to solve a new problem. I think quite a few of them, they will say, okay, let me go integrate with and figure out how I can call OpenAI's API and test the OpenAI models, and then figure out, perhaps massaging my data in some way or calling a different API to test Anthropics, then test Gemini's. And then, okay, I want to test also these open models. Let me also find a way I can test the Llama, the Quents, or the Deepseeks. And especially the moment you go to multimodal, then the tokenization, the way you interact with these models also starts looking very different. And testing every single model takes additional effort, even just to evaluate, right? And then to evaluate, do you need to evaluate against some of the existing academic benchmarks? For most of them, you need to integrate with one new different report. People install a different library for each one of them, and sometimes there are even conflicts between these dependencies. So even for that, you integrate against different APIs, integrate with different open models that all have their own way that you need to integrate with them, integrate with all the different evaluation libraries. And then if you need to, which is likely for enterprise scenarios, you say, okay, I care about these academic benchmarks, but I also have this specific benchmark of my own that better captures my enterprise scenario. And you need to figure out how you can integrate all this stuff. Now, even just for this, and you haven't even got to training yet, to give an idea with Oumi, you can come in a unified API. You can say, you know what, this is what I want to test. Actually, it's very easy to define your own extensible evaluation. Say, here's the responses, and here's my evaluator that, given a prompt response, here's how I say if that looks good or it doesn't look good. And then once you have that, you can define and evaluate any open or closed model with a unified API. You can just pretty much just add your API key for OpenAI or Anthropic or whatever you have, or switch and say, you know what, for Llama 8B, I want to evaluate, I don't know, that Phi or that Deepseek model. And that's all it takes. You just change the configuration. You add your credentials and API key if it needs an API key. And that's how you can switch and evaluate across any of the open models or closed models that you want to. Again, without having to integrate with all these different things. And then when you go to training, again, it's for every model, you may have to worry about a different way to integrate and test and evaluate. Whereas with Oumi, you can say, you know what, we can easily train with any of these open models. You only define what you want to train once. You even actually have recipes that for each model you want, you know what are reasonable hyperparameters and setups you can just use, even if you don't know, you're not a researcher, you don't know what exact hyperparameters you should be using. So even the recipe, you already have it out of the box. And then again, you want to switch from Llama to 8B to 405B, assuming you have the GPUs or any other model. You just change the name and the configuration, and that we have, again, ready-made recipes. And you can train with TRL, with TorchTune, with our own custom trainer that is a training loop that's a little bit easy to extend if you want to do that. But again, all of that within a unified API. You don't have to say, okay, now how do I integrate with this and test that? And again, this also moves over to, you want to curate data, synthesize data with any size model, curate it. All of these steps are very easy. And let's say, again, whether you're doing evaluation, inference, training, you can define this recipe once. And then if you want to move from your laptop, let's say to AWS, GCP, Azure, Together, Lambda, Rampod, or your own HPC, we have already tested 1,000 GPUs, all you need to change is a deployment configuration. You don't need to write any new code. And that's all it takes. You can automatically deploy and train or evaluate or do whatever you need to do. And what we tell people, it shouldn't be any harder than this, right? Because somebody needs to solve this problem once and then helps everybody else to do this work.
Right. Right. So it basically tries to remove the hard part where you have to do a bunch of things in order to compare or maybe develop different models, but it makes it easy for people to just plug and play different models and go on continue with what you are building rather than focusing on implementation and working with the nitty-gritty details.
Exactly. We're doing data synthesis, you don't have to worry about the batch processing and how to optimize that. If you want them to create data with an LLM judge, the framework is already there. You can just define your custom criteria and you can automatically both synthesize and clean up your data so you can feed it for training.
Yeah. I mean, just drawing parallels from my own experience, like I have been working with something called Monai, which is like a open source platform that was developed within NVIDIA. And I learned, like previous to that, like I was working with PyTorch, right? PyTorch has like some of the biggest open source platforms. And once I started working with medical imaging data, before I had access to Monai, I used to struggle a lot with medical imaging data because they are typically very huge in terms of chunks. Once you train a model after data transformations, it will just blow up the whole GPU. And that's when I Yeah, that's when I got started introduced to Monai, and now with Monai, it's something what you said, but mainly for vision data and vision architectures. But they do the same thing. Once you have a framework in place, you just change the model name. Let's say you want to use VGGNet instead of ResNet or something like that, but instead much more sophisticated. Like they have a whole library zoo. They call it like a model zoo where you have access to different models. But now once I just have one script, I can just train impossibly like all the models they have in the zoos with just plug and play.
Exactly. And what you mentioned about Moneta, that's for the traditional vision models. We do for foundation models for text, all multimodal.
Yeah.
And even the data sets, I forgot to mention about this. We're even already standardizing most of the common academic academic data sets. So if you want to use some of them to train your own models in combination with yours, you don't have to even do all the conversions and bring them to the same format so they can be consumed by the trainer. I mean, these are all things that people shouldn't have to redo across the community. So that's why
Right.
that we're standardizing. And then, yeah, if it's multimodal data, we're putting a lot of effort to making sure the pre-processing or the collation, everything is done efficiently so that the models and GPUs are used efficiently. And yeah, and all these things
Yeah.
shouldn't have to be reinvented by everybody. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, definitely. I love that. I'll definitely be leaving a link to the open source project in the show notes. So definitely people who are interested, they can check more in detail. I just have one rhetorical question while you were saying few things like, and I wonder what you think about it. Like this is maybe this question doesn't make sense, but let's say hypothetically, if you have access to a model that is super intelligent, like maybe in terms of names, we can give it like an AGI model that can do that. Would your first preference be open sourcing that, or would you wait for like safeguards around it? Like I took this inspiration of a question from a NeurIPS workshop. I think they asked it slightly bit different, but I wonder what you think about that. Like if you had that scenario, what would you do?
It's kind of hard to suggest. And the reason is that many people talk about AGI and people define it in many different ways. For example, Microsoft had a very different definition about how much monetary impact it can have compared to, I think OpenAI's definition. Um, I think we have to assess when we have such a technology to see, okay, what are the levels of misuse it could lead to, and how comfortable we feel to do this. Um, but while right now somebody may feel like, okay, I may have a button that could launch a nuclear missile. Should we give it to everybody, every single person? Because I think the way the question was phrased kind of feels a little bit like this. But I would say that getting to that point, it's a journey, and that's why I think it's more important that we open source these technologies now, as opposed to waiting months or years,
Yeah.
because then the community won't be ready and mature enough to develop the protections and understand how these things work. So that's why it's even more critical that, the sooner the better that we open source technology so that when the time comes, we have understood them better as a community, not a single company, and we can make those decisions or we have built the protections. Because if you're asking me right now, I have something that the community has never seen, should I open source it to everyone? Yeah, it makes me a little bit concerned as well.
Yeah. I mean, I love that answer. Yeah, I think it's even I think Jan LeCun and like few other researchers have said that, right? Like it's gonna be a transition. It's not gonna be the thing that you wake up next day and you have a model that is like surprisingly very smart than all of us combined, or the smartest humans. So I think it will be like a very slow transition, and there won't be like a aha moment. It will be like a gradual pace of adoption and then outperforming the additional tasks.
Yeah.
But since you mentioned, like I think tying back to the earlier point where you basically envision something like a Linux moment for AI, what kind of milestones do you have in mind where it will give you a signal saying that yes, I am on the right track, or maybe I am already there? Like what kind of feedback you are expecting from the community or researchers or corporations where you say, yes, I have been successful in open sourcing AI?
Yeah. That's a very good question. So I would say when we launched, the response of the community was extremely strong, but I would still think that most people still don't know that Umi exists. But even with that, we got within 24 hours, it was trending as number one on GitHub. I think we got over 5,000 stars within the first 2 weeks. We got over 100 people that volunteered and say, you know what, I want to help in this research. Just tell me how. Most people are technical. Some of them, they're not even technical. So, I still want to be involved and help. I'm now organizing all these efforts and all these people to contribute. Um, but let's see. Actually, with that, Jay, I have to say I forgot your question.
Oh, yeah. My question was basically like, what kind of milestones would you have in your
Oh,
life
right,
that
right.
will send you a signal saying that you are on track to?
Right, right, right. So the initial response from the community was already very strong, and that, well, as I tell people, what was my conviction a year ago when we launched and we saw that response from the community, it became very strong confidence because we saw the reaction of the people who got to know about this, how they reacted, both academic community, but also from enterprises. Um, to give you an idea, 2 out of 3 people that interact with our GitHub repository, they're actually enterprises, and just in this few weeks that we launched, we got a lot of inbound, not from small startups, actually from small startups, but also from some of the Fortune 1000 enterprise. Actually, some actually, I don't want to reveal the names because with some of them are also under NDA, but some of the largest banks, insurance companies, and others, where they say, you know what, we need something like this because we can't send our data to OpenAI. We need something that is more private, we can control, we can deploy on our own VPC or even on-prem. And even the case that it would be okay for us to send our data to OpenAI, we understand that this AI capability is very important for us. So we want to have more flexibility and more control. And actually, even those discussions we had in the last couple of weeks from enterprise that came as inbound was a strong validation that which again I kind of knew that because I've been talking to enterprise from again month or two almost that ChatGPT came out because I could see that people like the early adopters, the more mature AI first companies that were already asking for this, and now that you see from more and more companies that are like, you know what, I can't just call a black box by OpenAI. This is important. I need to have more control, more flexibility, or I care about privacy of my data. Uh,
Right.
so that's why the validation was very strong. I would say it was not a huge surprise to me because I was expecting that things are like that. I could see the signals. They became even stronger and clearer to more and more people since we launched.
Yeah. And this again, like if I were to tie back this to my experience, like it's very interesting because you said like you attended some health summit sometime back, right? And this brings me back to the point, like I think even talking to my professor last year, we had this consensus that because we primarily publish in medical journals, we work at the intersection. Um, every now and then we get reviewers where they are very skeptical even of ResNet models. So once we are using medical imaging data, which is like in its raw format, we use AI models to do some predictions. And the first reviewer comment, because these are like medical doctors who have been in the field of practice since like more than 20 years, so it's very hard for them to understand like how this models would look like and what they are doing. And I wonder what really they would think of large language models, because this is like taking one black box and like a bunch of black boxes. So it's like very hard for them to interpret. So I can imagine like why that concern comes from. And I think trusting something like Umi would make more sense, that at least they have someone who can maybe attest to like what's happening. Maybe it's still a black box, but still I can understand like I'm not injecting anything that's nonsense, and maybe like it's the garbage in garbage out analogy. So yeah.
Exactly, exactly. Somebody can fully audit, how you train this, that there's any inherent biases. And even our given the community can help make it better to make sure it works.
Yeah.
Because there's been a lot of pitfalls in the past with this technology where they work well for people from specific ethnicities, but not for others, especially if they're image models. Yeah.
Yeah. And one other question I wanted to ask, and this is like me asking as a master's or PhD student, like when I always used to um, get help from communities. Like I'm forever indebted to communities like PyTorch, right? Because they have been critical in understanding. What kind of challenges do you think go into building these communities? Because I understand like getting researchers to work, like for example, like I mean you said like you had more than 100 volunteers sign up, but like even you had something to offer where 100 volunteers signed up. So like I wanted to know like what exactly do you think are the challenges of building such a community, because not a lot of people appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I would say it's definitely not easy. And I will be candid here to say that, I was also by no means an expert in building communities before this effort. But I think, even going back to what made Linux have a community is that you can start something and say, you know what, I'm going to have the biggest community. You need to start from the solo experience. Does that make sense for the individual user as they do their individual work, research, whatever that is, to use this? And then as more and more people use it, they find it useful compared to what they were using before, then the community gets built around it. And that was the principle that we started with Oumi. Well, we said, you know what, we want to make it easy for people to build on top of each other. So, you know what, it needs to be a great tool for solo experience, for solo use. But also we're gonna make sure we build all these things that arguably actually they help both the solo experience, but also help collaboration, which is make sure everything is fully recordable. And this is easy not just for somebody else to reproduce your work, but even for you, for yourself, for your own sanity, to know how exactly did I run this experiment? What was the full configuration, all the details about all the steps? Uh, anyway, so yeah, in many ways, actually, these two are not even in contradiction. If anything, you know, they're very well aligned. But you know, again, besides making something that it's very good for individual use, make it easy for everybody to build on top of the work of each other. Our plan was also to be intentional about building this community. That's why, you know, we want to make sure that the word gets out there so people find this useful, because as I tell people, the best way to make this effort succeed for the benefit of the sciences, industry, humanity overall, is if we all work together to make, you know, the Linux of AI. If it's just a
Yeah.
company of 10 or the existing 100 volunteers, you know, it won't cut it. But anyway, that's why, you know, our hope is to help the community. You know, that's why we have also the Discord. If they have questions, help we can provide to help them. If specific people are doing research in areas that are high priority for us, we may even try to help them work compute wherever we can, even though, again, we don't have compute to distribute to everyone. But yeah, we plan to do events. That's why also we worked a lot with our documentation and everything to make sure it's very clear. So again, it's easy for people to start using. But yeah, we plan to do more and more community events, both to help encourage people, also make it easier to give people things they can work on and they can help improve the models and the platform. But yeah, it will take some effort.
Yeah, definitely. I'm definitely being a fan of open source communities. Like I'll be definitely putting a track on that, and like I'll be just happy to see how this progresses. And one thing I forgot to ask you, I think because we focus so much on closed source and open source AI, is like I wanted to also know, because I think you might be giving more than 100% of your time to like just focusing on building this community. But I wonder like if you have any specific research projects that you are also working on as a researcher, like that targets any specific application or part of architectures rather than just working on this platform. Like I would love to learn more about that.
Yeah. Just to give you an example, Jay, just about 2.5 weeks ago, we collaborated with Emre and also Dilek and Gökhan Tour from UIUC. And we helped them actually train and scale up their existing research work to train a bigger model, going to 70B or even 405B Llama, which I'm not sure how many other universities have managed to do, and train an agentic model that it was beating GPT-4o in some benchmarks. And also on the Berkeley Function Calling Leaderboard, it was beating Gemini, Claude, Mistral Large. And anyway, it was very, very impressive results. And as I tell people, you know, I'm very excited about the results. Also, it takes only 2 commands for somebody to reproduce it. You do pip install Oumi train with the configuration, the recipe, and you can reproduce the work and then go and improve it and do your own research to extend it. Literally within hours, you can be in the business of improving somebody else's research and getting your own paper. So, but anyway, besides that, we are doing some other work on hallucination detection, which is a problem. I think it's both important for academia and for industry, in collaboration with NYU. Let's see, what else? Yeah, there's some new collaborations we're discussing with Princeton about how we can help around long context and make those models better. Um, um, yeah, and and actually besides that, I forgot to mention, there's a couple other projects we have posted in our Discord. We have a channel that's called Project Ideas, where we post project ideas. Actually, we have quite a few already, and when enough people sign up, we move them into the other channel that's called Active Projects. And there's already some projects that have moved there that have to, for example, about evaluating R1 style and building better LLM judges using reasoning models like R1. And yeah, we have quite a few research ideas there, some of them already turning into active projects. And we have also some bigger efforts that we're planning to start, which is how we can best work with the community to advance general instruct foundation models. But for details for that, I think they're going to be coming out in a matter of hopefully weeks.
Yeah. I love that. Like if we have access to that Discord channel, maybe I'll also link that
Yep.
in the show notes. I think that would be, I think, super useful for the audience that is listening to these podcasts. So I'll definitely leave a link to that.
Yeah, I would strongly encourage people to both try the Umi on GitHub or Discord, because again, as I like to emphasize, this can only work if we work together as a community. So we need all hands on deck to make this the best tool that we have and the best models, for all of us. Because
Yeah.
that's our thesis, that this core foundation, the code, the data, those generic foundation models should be a public utility for all of us. And there's still enough opportunities for us as a company or anybody else to monetize and build, very narrow specific solutions that enterprises need. But whatever you need for the open community and the sciences, that foundation should be fully open.
Yeah. I completely agree. And yeah, I think to just wrap up the conversation, like one question I normally tend to ask any guest that I have on this podcast is, what kind of tips would you have as a, because you graduated from Princeton some time back and you have been in the field for such a time, I think over a decade, and you have seen different organizations, you have seen different projects, and now you have your own platform that you are trying to build. What kind of advice you would give to AI researchers who might be getting sometimes started very soon? Like what kind of pitfalls that you would suggest for those students to avoid and kind of focus? Because the most of the problems that I at least like when students reach out to me is getting started, right? Because they have a plethora of topics, plethora of domains that they can focus on. How to get started, because it's either like one field is sexy than the other or the other way around. How would you recommend people get started in AI in general?
Yeah. Let's see. Let's see if I have a good answer for this. Um, I said there's definitely a plethora of topics and research areas all across. And quite often, what I hear from many students, including some people that I've been talking to very recently, is that, oh, this field is very crowded. I'm going to maybe go try something else. Um, the best way I like to put it is, focus on the impact. Yeah, some things may look more shiny versus less shiny, but, and it's also unfortunate. That's why also, I mean, PhDs to graduate, they need papers. And usually what is currently hot is usually what may help perhaps get a paper out. And if it's less crowded field, may help get papers out. But if anything, I would suggest that, or at least it would be good that, our academic capacity, our best researchers and students, all of them, they work on the problems that we think is going to be the most impactful ones, not necessarily the most shiny ones. Because some enterprises, again, they may focus on the more um, um, problems that can be translated into money more easily than others. But we need our independent researchers, we need our academic community to be working on all the other problems like safety for LLMs that are important. Uh, yeah, I mean, is that as shiny perhaps as some multi-agent scenarios or reasoning? Uh, but although I would argue you could apply reasoning to improve safety, and there you go. And then you can have both
Yeah.
impact and hit the shiny factor. Um, by the way, if somebody's interested in this, come talk to me. I would love to discuss with you about it. Uh,
Yeah.
um, but anyway, that would be at least my hope is that, and I would like to think that if you do impactful work, that's also a factor. That what, this is important work. It's not just it's shiny. That also helps you get the papers published. Anyway, that would begin my hope. Is that, or my advice is that to work on problems that matter, that help move the needle forward. They're not necessarily shiny, but they help make those important technologies better for all of us.
Yeah. And I wonder, because I think maybe you graduated in 2011, I
11.
think, or if yeah. And like I wonder, like if you were to look back at AI trajectories right now, has like in your opinion, do you think the pathway to AI research has changed over the years? Because I don't know, at least like I think this is like those one of those answers where you see, or you always feel like our generation is doing much more worse than the previous generation. So like I always feel there's a kind of publisher perish culture, like people are getting overloaded. It's very daunting to at least see people's research works getting published, because they tend to be like from big labs. Like I do feel there is some concentration of research being published in the big venues. So I wonder, how you can contrast this with your experience of doing a PhD. Was it the same in some way or the other? And the barrier for getting into AI research, like how do you see that has changed in
Yeah.
the last few
If
years?
anything, I would say that unfortunately the barrier may have, at least my understanding is that the barrier may have increased. If anything, there might be more competition. Maybe I don't have the data, but I would hypothesize that universities they may have increased how many students they admit for AI. I would like to think, but at the same time, I can imagine that competition has increased. In my case, I got into AI. I started doing my research on what's called IoT distributed systems. It's just that the first iPhone came out, and I told my advisors I want to work on how you can do distributed applications, and I kind of got into AI because of that with these systems because you have a lot of data you collect, sensory stuff, and now you need something like AI to do something meaningful, and that's how I got into AI. Almost like actually pioneering a lot of the ideas for now what we call on-device AI. Back then it was, saying, oh, you can do AI on device. It's more privacy preserving, low latency, low this, low that. Um, Arguably a few years ahead of its time before industry picked it up. Um, uh, but I remember when I was at Microsoft and I was already working a lot on NLP. I was reading one machine learning book after the other to the point that my friends would make fun of me every time I would get a new book and read it. Um, is that uh, after a couple of years, I don't remember exactly when, I started hearing more and more companies like Google, Microsoft saying we're an AI first company. And then I could see as an engineering manager, I started getting people asking to join my group because I was already working on AI problems. So, you know what? I have no AI experience, but I want to work on AI. I would love to join your team. And I would reject so many people to the point they would tell me, okay, I thought that transferring within Microsoft is easy. Why are you rejecting me? I was like, I'm very sorry. There's such high demand. There's so many people that want to transition into AI. And, it's just,
Yeah.
it's just hard. But anyway, I could see back from that date, again, I don't know, 2011 that I graduated, plus maybe 2, 3 years, I don't remember exactly what the year was, that there was a very growing demand for people in enterprise, for students, especially as more and more enterprise, Google, Microsoft, and others, I would say we're an AI first company, that suddenly AI became suddenly so hot that, there's like huge demand for students. And now, to give you an idea, we work with some undergrads and they're already looking into publishing papers so they could get admitted in some of the best, schools. I'm like, that's impressive. I didn't have any paper when I was an undergrad. I still got
Yeah.
into Princeton, but I had no papers. So if I had no papers now, I don't know what my life would have been, but yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like I think we also have a bunch of undergrads in our lab, and once but like there was a time we started working with genomic data, and at least in my undergrad in my high school, like I didn't learn about genomics. All I knew was like DNA stands, like what is the abbreviation for DNA. That's all I had my knowledge into that. And we had undergrads and high school students who join, and they actually understand what exactly DNA means and like how do you load these data sets in Python. And I was like, wow, like if I were to compete with these students, it's definitely getting much. So I mean,
Yes.
definitely people are much more educated. Like I think they have access to a lot of information, so like they can form their opinions about their interests in AI much more sooner. But yeah, and maybe one of the last questions I have is because you did mention you had the transition of working in AI from the industry, like I think in some way or the other you learned your skills along the way, not as a part of your graduate or undergraduate curriculum. What kind of advices would you give to students where what kind of skills do you think are much more also important apart from your technical knowledge to make yourself successful in AI career? Like
Yeah.
you yeah.
If anything, I would say the drive to be always learning. Because as I said, I did some AI on my during my PhD in my undergrad, it was minimal. I took actually an AI course, but it was mostly state space exploration, like alpha beta pruning, A star, and such algorithms, barely any neural networks. But anyway, it was the desire to keep learning, actually keeping your eyes out about, where are things going? Because I started getting excited about AI way before anybody, way it became the new fad that, everybody now want to do AI. But yeah, if anything specific for AI is, and I would argue it's the same thing for any technology field, but arguably even more for computer science, even more for AI. It's moving very fast. And to stay relevant, you need to have the internal drive to always be learning and staying relevant because otherwise it's easy. for your knowledge to become obsolete. Yeah, it's moving very fast.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, I love that answer. But yeah, I think on that note, I think we covered all the questions I had for you on the podcast. I think we covered like, and the most important thing is understanding open source versus closed source AI. So definitely we had a good discussion on that. And maybe I'll also leave the links that we have talked to. I think your research work and also the Oumi as a community and Discord channel. So like people who are interested in this particular topic, they can join and maybe connect with you and the community better. But apart from that, thanks a lot for sharing your insights. I do think I personally do like what you're doing, and that's how we like I try to interview you for the podcast. So keep on doing the good work, and yeah, hopefully we can connect sometime in future.
Thank you very much, Jay, for having me on the podcast. I really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you.